The heavyweight champion stood in the center of that Kansas City gym, 240 pounds of muscle and tournament victories. He looked at the man across from him and laughed. "Hollywood," he said. "Kansas City, Missouri. Midtown Athletic Club. February 14th, 1974. Thursday evening, 7:30 p.m. The gym smelled like every serious martial arts dojo in America smelled in 1974. Sweat, canvas, wood polish. Cigarette smoke drifting in from the lobby where spectators waited between matches. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that familiar institutional glow across the hardwood floor. This wasn't a stadium. This wasn't Madison Square Garden. This was a working gym where real fighters trained, where local tournaments happened, where reputations were built one match at a time. The kind of place where you proved yourself or went home embarrassed. Tonight was supposed to be a demonstration, a friendly exhibition between schools. The Midtown Karate Association hosting visitors from California. Standard stuff. Respectful exchanges. Technical demonstrations. Maybe some light sparring for the 100 or so people gathered in the bleachers. But standing in the center of the mat was a man who had other ideas. His name was Frank the Tank Morrison. 6'4", 240 pounds, 28 years old. Four-time Midwest Regional Heavyweight Karate Champion. Undefeated in his division for 3 years. 37 consecutive victories. Frank Morrison was not here for friendly demonstrations. He stood center mat in his competition GI, arms crossed, surveying the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong. His black belt was worn, legitimate, earned through years of brutal training and harder competition. His knuckles were scarred from breaking boards, bricks, ice blocks. His shins were conditioned from thousands of repetitions against heavy bags and makiwara boards. Frank Morrison was the real thing. Everyone in Kansas City knew it. Everyone in the Midwest karate circuit knew it. And Frank Morrison made sure everyone remembered it. The demonstration was scheduled to start at 8 p.m. It was 7:45 p.m. The California visitors were late. Frank paced the mat, warming up with low kicks, checking his stance, rolling his shoulders. His students sat in the front row, watching their teacher with the reverence reserved for proven champions. The Midtown Club instructor, an older gentleman named Sensei Williams, stood near the edge of the mat, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "They should be here by now," Williams said, checking his watch for the third time. "Maybe they got lost," Frank said, not bothering to hide his smirk. California people aren't used to real cities. A few people in the crowd chuckled. The tension was building. Everyone could feel it. Then the door opened. 3 men walked in. 2 were clearly students, carrying equipment bags, wearing casual clothes. The third man was smaller than the other 2. Maybe 5'10", maybe 170 pounds. He wore dark slacks and a simple button-down shirt. His hair was neat. His expression was calm. He moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested he wasn't here to make an impression. "That's them?" someone in the crowd whispered. "Where's their instructor?" another voice asked. Sensei Williams walked over to greet them. He shook hands with the man in the button-down shirt, spoke quietly for a moment, then turned back to the crowd. "Everyone, this is Mr. Norris. Chuck Norris. He's a karate instructor from California. He and his students will be demonstrating some techniques tonight." The crowd's reaction was polite but muted. A few people applauded. Most just watched, curious, sizing up the visitors. Frank Morrison's reaction was different. He didn't move from center mat. He just looked at Chuck Norris and laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A genuine, dismissive laugh. "Hollywood," Frank said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They sent us Hollywood." Chuck Norris didn't react visibly. He simply removed his jacket, handed it to one of his students, and began rolling up his sleeves. Frank Morrison's comment had touched a nerve in the martial arts community, but maybe not the way he intended. By 1974, Chuck Norris was indeed becoming known in Hollywood. He'd appeared in a few films. He'd done some stunt work. Word was getting around about this karate guy who could act. But what Frank Morrison didn't know, what most of the crowd didn't know, was that before Hollywood, Chuck Norris had been something else entirely. He'd been a United States Air Force military policeman stationed in South Korea. He'd started training in Tang, Soo-do there. He'd earned his black belt in 1959. He'd competed in tournaments throughout the 1960s, winning consistently, building a reputation not through movies, but through actual competition. He'd won the All-American Karate Championship in 1967. He'd defended that title in 1968. He'd won the World Middleweight Karate Championship. He'd fought real matches against real fighters, not choreographed scenes against stuntmen. But Frank Morrison didn't know any of this. All Frank knew was what he'd heard. Some movie guy from California. Some actor playing martial artist for the cameras. But nobody in that gym realized what Frank's ignorance was about to cost him. Chuck finished rolling up his sleeves and stepped onto the mat. His students stayed back near the wall, setting down their bags, pulling out some training equipment for the planned demonstration. "You want to warm up first?" Sensei Williams asked Chuck quietly. "I'm fine," Chuck said. His voice was even, professional, carrying no emotion. Frank Morrison walked toward him, each step deliberate, meant to establish dominance through sheer physical presence. He stopped about 6 feet away, towering over Chuck by 6 inches, outweighing him by 70 pounds. "So what are we doing here, Hollywood? You going to show us some movie kicks? Some Hollywood fighting?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the tone of a friendly demonstration. This was something else. Chuck looked up at Frank Morrison without tilting his head back much. His expression remained neutral. "Sensei Williams invited us to demonstrate some techniques. That's what we're here for." "Demonstrate on who?" Frank's smile was predatory. "Your students? Gonna show us how you teach actors to fake it." Sensei Williams stepped forward. "Frank, this is supposed to be." "I got a better idea," Frank interrupted, his eyes never leaving Chuck. "Why don't we do some light sparring? Nothing serious. Just show these folks what real karate looks like compared to." He gestured vaguely at Chuck. "Whatever you do in California." The challenge hung in the air. Everyone in the gym understood what was happening. This wasn't about technique demonstration anymore. This was about Frank Morrison asserting dominance, putting the outsider in his place, defending his territory. Chuck Norris stood quietly for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Light contact." "Sure," Frank said. "Light contact. Controlled. Friendly." His tone suggested he didn't mean any of those words. Sensei Williams looked between them, clearly wanting to stop this, but also knowing that refusing now would create even worse tension. "Gentlemen, let's keep this respectful. This is a demonstration, not a competition." "Absolutely," Frank said, his smile never wavering. "Respect. That's what karate's all about." They moved to opposite sides of the mat. Chuck's students exchanged glances. One of them, a young man named Jim, leaned toward his partner. "Should we?" "No." The other student cut him off. "Mr. Norris knows what he's doing." Frank Morrison settled into his fighting stance. It was textbook heavyweight karate. Deep, solid, rooted. His lead hand was out, his rear hand chambered. His weight was distributed perfectly for power generation. Every element of his posture telegraphed one message: "I am bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than you." Chuck Norris stood naturally. His stance wasn't deep. His hands weren't chambered. To someone unfamiliar with martial arts, he might have looked unprepared, casual, almost vulnerable. To someone who understood fighting, his positioning was something else entirely. Balanced, mobile, ready. The crowd leaned forward. The gym fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sensei Williams raised his hand. "Ready? Begin." Frank Morrison moved first. He was fast for his size, genuinely fast. He closed the distance with a quick step and threw a Made Jerry, a front snap kick, aimed at Chuck's midsection. Controlled, but with enough force behind it to make a point. Chuck wasn't there when the kick arrived. He'd shifted offline, not dramatically, just enough. The kick extended into empty air. Frank recovered quickly, professionally. He followed with a reverse punch, a gyakuzuki, thrown from his rear hand with proper hip rotation. Power and technique combined. Chuck's hand came up, redirected the punch past his shoulder. Contact was minimal. A touch. A deflection. The punch continued past him harmlessly. The crowd murmured. Frank's techniques were good. Clean. But they weren't landing. Frank increased his pace. He threw a combination: jab, reverse punch, roundhouse kick. Tournament-tested sequences. Techniques that had won him 3 consecutive championships. Chuck moved through them like water finding paths around stones. Not blocking forcefully, not dodging dramatically, just not being where the techniques arrived. His footwork was minimal, economical. His hand movements were small, precise. 30 seconds into the exchange, Frank Morrison hadn't landed a single clean technique. Not because his karate was bad. It wasn't. It was excellent. But it wasn't connecting. This was when people in the front row started to recognize something they hadn't seen coming. Frank's breathing was getting heavier. Not from exhaustion, from frustration. He was a champion. He didn't miss. He didn't throw perfect techniques that hit nothing but air. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He reset his stance, deeper this time, more committed. He was done playing. Done with light contact. He wanted to land something, anything, to re-establish his dominance. He launched a Mawashi Jerry, a powerful roundhouse kick, aimed at Chuck's head. The kind of kick that ends demonstrations. The kind of technique that sends people to the hospital if it connects. Chuck's response was instantaneous. He stepped inside the arc of the kick, inside the range where the technique had no power. His right hand came up, controlled Frank's kicking leg at the knee. His left hand, simultaneously, delivered a ridge hand strike to Frank's neck. The strike stopped an inch from contact. Perfect control. Perfect placement. Exactly where the carotid artery was vulnerable. Frank's eyes went wide. He was balanced on one leg. His kick was controlled. His neck was exposed. If Chuck Norris had wanted to finish this, it would have been finished. Chuck held the position for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for Frank to understand. Long enough for the crowd to see. Then he released, stepped back, and returned to his natural stance. The gym was absolutely silent. Someone in the back row dropped something. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Frank Morrison stood there, both feet back on the ground, his face flushed. Not from exertion. From the realization of what had just happened. A technique that should have been unstoppable had been countered before it could even develop. And the counter had come from a man who moved with a calm that suggested he'd been in this position 1,000 times before. Sensei Williams stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I think." "Again," Frank said. Chuck looked at him without expression. "This isn't necessary." "Again," Frank repeated. His voice had changed. The mockery was gone. What replaced it was something rawer. The need of a man whose identity was being challenged. "You got lucky. Let's go again." Chuck Norris stood there for a long moment, reading Frank Morrison's face, his posture, his energy. Then he nodded once. They reset. This time Frank didn't waste energy on combinations. He went direct. A straight punch, thrown with his full body weight, aimed at Chuck's face. Not light contact. Not controlled. A real attempt to connect. Chuck slipped it. His head moved perhaps 3 inches to the left. Frank's fist passed by his ear. As Frank's arm extended, Chuck was already moving. He stepped to the outside, his right hand controlling Frank's extended arm, and delivered a back fist to Frank's temple. Again, the technique stopped just short of contact. Again, the placement was perfect. Again, the control was absolute. Frank stumbled slightly, caught off balance by his own committed punch and the sudden control of his arm. Chuck released him immediately and stepped back. The second exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were completely silent, watching something they hadn't expected to see. Watching a 240-pound champion being systematically dismantled by a man who barely seemed to be trying. Frank Morrison's face had gone from flushed to pale. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the recognition that everything he believed about his own abilities, everything that had been validated through years of victories, was being questioned by the reality unfolding in front of him. "One more time," Frank said quietly. Chuck looked at Sensei Williams. Sensei Williams looked at the crowd, at Frank's students in the front row, at the situation that had spiraled far beyond a friendly demonstration. He should stop this. He knew he should stop this. But he also knew that Frank Morrison needed to see this through. Needed to find whatever he was looking for in this confrontation. "Light contact only," Sensei Williams said firmly. "Both of you." They faced each other a third time. Frank was breathing harder now, despite having thrown maybe 10 techniques total. The breathing wasn't physical. It was mental, the weight of realization. He threw a spinning back kick, a Ushiro Jerry. It was desperate. Spinning techniques are risky against aware opponents, but Frank was past strategy. He needed to land something. Chuck simply stepped off the line. The kick spun past him. As Frank rotated, trying to find his target, Chuck was already there. Inside his guard. Close range. Where the size difference meant nothing. Chuck's hand touched Frank's solar plexus. Not a strike. A touch. A placement. Showing exactly where the technique would have landed. Then Chuck did something that would be discussed in that Kansas City gym for the next 10 years. He He stepped back and lowered his hands completely, dropped his guard, offered his own solar plexus as a target. Your turn, Chuck said quietly. The invitation was clear. I showed you where I could have struck. Now you show me. Frank Morrison stood there, breathing hard, staring at the opening Chuck had given him. A free shot, a chance to land something, to save face, to prove he wasn't completely outclassed. He didn't take it. Instead, Frank Morrison lowered his own hands, bowed formally, deeply, the bow of a student to a teacher, the bow of a man acknowledging a truth he could no longer deny. Thank you, Frank said quietly. Thank you for the lesson. The room erupted, not in cheers, in a collective release of tension that had been building for the last 3 minutes. People started talking simultaneously, asking questions, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The domination hadn't been violent. It had been technical, educational, a demonstration not of cruelty, but of such overwhelming skill that resistance became pointless. Sensei Williams approached both men. His hands were shaking slightly as he shook Chuck's hand, then Frank's. That was... He started, then stopped, unable to find words. That was necessary, Chuck said simply. Sometimes the lesson needs to be physical. Frank Morrison stood there, his students approaching cautiously, unsure how to address their teacher who had just been systematically dismantled. Frank waved them away gently. Mr. Norris, Frank said, can we talk? Privately. Chuck nodded. They walked to the edge of the mat, away from the crowd, near the equipment storage area. The 2 students Chuck had brought with him stayed back, giving space. I need to understand something, Frank said, his voice low. You didn't hit me. Not once. You could have. Multiple times. What? Chuck looked at him directly. Because that's not why I'm here. I didn't come to Kansas City to prove anything to you or to anyone else. I came to do a demonstration. You escalated it. I know, Frank said. I know I did. I heard Hollywood and I assumed. You assumed I was playing at martial arts, Chuck finished for him. That I was an actor pretending to be a fighter instead of a fighter who sometimes acts. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly what I assumed. I started training in 1959, Chuck said. I've been competing in tournaments since 1964. I've won championships. Not movie championships. Real ones. Against real fighters. Some of them bigger than you. Some of them just as good technically as you. How did you? Frank struggled with the question. How did you see everything coming? Every technique I threw, you were already moving before I finished the setup. Chuck considered how to answer. You're a good fighter, Frank. Your techniques are clean. Your power is real. But you telegraph. Shoulder dips before you kick. Weight shifts before you punch. Small things. Things that work in tournaments where everyone's trained the same way. But against someone looking for those tells, they're obvious. Nobody's ever read me like that before, Frank said. Because you've been fighting people trained in the same system, Chuck explained. Same stances, same techniques, same setups. They're looking for the same things you're looking for. But I was trained in Korea. Different system. Different approach. I learned to read movement differently. Frank absorbed this. The movie stuff. Is it real? Are you actually in films now? Some, Chuck admitted. Small parts. Stunt work. But that's not who I am. That's just something I do. Who I am is what you saw on that mat tonight. A martial artist. That comes first. What Frank Morrison said next would change the trajectory of both their careers. I want to learn from you, Frank said directly. Not tonight. Not in front of a crowd. But I want to understand what you just did. How you see fighting. Because what I saw tonight. I've never seen that before. And I've seen a lot. Chuck studied him. Saw sincerity where arrogance had been before. Saw humility where pride had stood minutes earlier. Come to California, Chuck said. My school in Torrance. Spend a week. Train with my students. I'll show you what I showed you tonight, but slower. Explained. So you can understand the principles. You'd teach me? After you challenged me publicly and I showed you why that was a mistake? Chuck's expression softened slightly. Frank, you're not the first fighter who needed to learn humility. You won't be the last. The question is what you do with the lesson. Frank extended his hand. Chuck shook it firmly. No animosity. No grudge. Just 2 martial artists finding mutual respect through confrontation. They returned to the mat. The planned demonstration continued. Chuck and his students showed techniques, explained principles, answered questions. Frank Morrison sat in the front row, watching not with the bored superiority he'd shown an hour earlier, but with genuine interest. taking mental notes, seeing details he'd missed before. When the demonstration ended, people approached Chuck, asked about his school in California, asked about his competition record, asked about the techniques he'd shown. The word Hollywood wasn't mentioned again that night. Not as a joke, not as a dismissal. As Chuck packed his equipment, preparing to leave, one of Frank's students approached him nervously. "Mr. Norris? Can I ask you something?" Chuck nodded. "My teacher. Frank, he's never lost. Not like that. Not in front of people. How is he supposed to come back from this?" Chuck looked at the young student seriously. "Your teacher didn't lose tonight. He learned. There's a difference. A loss is when you walk away with nothing. A lesson is when you walk away with something you didn't have before. Frank Morrison walked away tonight with humility. That's worth more than another trophy." But everyone saw a man encounter someone better than him and have the integrity to acknowledge it instead of making excuses. Chuck interrupted gently. "That takes more courage than winning ever does. Your teacher's reputation isn't damaged. It's enhanced. People respect honesty more than they respect undefeated records." The student considered this, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir." 6 weeks later, Frank the Tank Morrison showed up in Torrance, California. He stayed for 9 days. Trained morning and evening. Learned Wing Chun principles. Learned how to read telegraphs. Learned how to move without commitment. Learned that being a champion in one system didn't make you a complete fighter. He returned to Kansas City different. Not weaker, not defeated, but more complete, more aware. When he competed in tournaments after that, his approach had changed. He won his 5th consecutive Midwest Regional Championship later that year. But the way he fought was different. More economical, less telegraphed, more aware. People noticed. Judges noticed. Other competitors noticed. The Tank had evolved. When asked what changed, Frank always told the same story. The night he called someone Hollywood and learned the most expensive lesson of his martial arts career. The story spread through the karate tournament circuit of the 1970s. Small gyms, regional competitions, places where reputations were built on actual fighting, not media coverage. The story was always the same. Chuck Norris walked into a Kansas City gym, got challenged by the local champion, and systematically dismantled him without throwing a single real strike. Some people didn't believe it, called it exaggeration, myth-making. How could someone avoid every technique without getting hit? How could the confrontation end without real contact? But the people who were there that Thursday evening knew the truth. They'd seen it, witnessed it. The 100 or so spectators who came expecting a friendly demonstration and instead watched a masterclass in control, timing, and technique. Decades later, in 2008, a karate historian named Richard Kim was documenting the tournament careers of 1960s and 70s fighters. He interviewed Frank Morrison, by then a respected sensei with his own school, teaching students who didn't know about that night in 1974. "Tell me about Chuck Norris," Kim asked during the recorded interview. Frank Morrison, 62 years old, smiled in a way that suggested the memory still stung, but in a good way. "Everyone knows Chuck from the movies now," Frank said. "Walker, Texas Ranger. The Delta Force. Missing in action. That's who Chuck Norris is to most people. An action star. But you knew him differently," Kim prompted. "I knew him for exactly 47 seconds, Frank said. That's how long it took for him to show me that everything I thought I knew about fighting was incomplete. Not wrong. Just incomplete." "What do you mean?" "I was a champion," Frank explained. "Undefeated. I thought that meant I was the best. But being the best in your division, in your region, in your system, that doesn't mean you're the best overall. That's what Chuck showed me. Not by hurting me, by showing me how easily he could have. Do you resent him for it?" Frank Morrison laughed. "Resent him? Richard, Chuck Norris gave me the greatest gift a martial artist can receive. He showed me my limitations while I was still young enough to do something about them. Most fighters learn their limitations in the ring, in front of cameras, in ways that end careers. Chuck taught me privately, respectfully, in a way that let me grow from it." You visited his school afterward. "Best 9 days of my martial arts education. I learned more in that week than I had in the previous 5 years. Not because my previous training was bad. It wasn't. But because Chuck showed me a completely different way of seeing combat. Wing Chun principles. Economy of motion. Reading telegraphs. Sensitivity training. Concepts that karate touched on, but didn't emphasize the way Chuck did. Did it change how you fought? Completely. I won 3 more regional championships after that. But I was a different fighter. More efficient. Less wasteful. More aware. My students noticed. My opponents noticed. The judges noticed. And your reputation? After being defeated so publicly? Frank Morrison looked directly at the camera. Let me be clear about something. Chuck Norris didn't defeat me that night. He educated me. And anyone who was there, anyone who saw what actually happened, they understood that. I wasn't humiliated. I was humbled. There's a profound difference. The interview was published in Martial Arts Masters, Untold Stories of the 1970s Tournament Circuit. It included testimony from 5 other people who'd been present that night in Kansas City. Their accounts matched Frank's precisely. The details, the timeline, the 47 seconds, the control, the demonstration of overwhelming skill without violence. One witness, a junior instructor named Tom Bradley who'd been sitting in the 3rd row, provided perhaps the most telling detail. The thing everyone remembers is how Chuck avoided every technique, Bradley recalled. But what struck me, what I think about even now, is what happened after. Chuck could have embarrassed Frank, could have gloated, could have used that moment to promote himself. Instead, he offered to teach, turned a confrontation into an opportunity for growth. That's when I understood that Chuck Norris wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was a skilled teacher. And teaching is harder than fighting. The Midtown Athletic Club in Kansas City closed in 1987. The building was converted to office space. But people who trained there in the 1970s still gather occasionally. Veterans of that tournament circuit, now in their 60s and 70s. Still practicing, still teaching. They tell stories about the competitions they won, the techniques they mastered, the fighters they respected. And they tell one particular story about a Thursday evening in February 1974, when a man from California walked into their gym, got called Hollywood by someone who should have known better, and spent 47 seconds teaching a lesson that nobody present would ever forget. Sensei Williams, the club instructor who organized that demonstration, passed away in 1995. But before he died, he wrote a memoir titled 50 Years on the Mat, Lessons from a Lifetime in Karate. In Chapter 14, he devoted 4 pages to that evening, to Frank Morrison's challenge, to Chuck Norris's response, to the lesson everyone learned. The chapter ended with this paragraph. In 50 years of teaching martial arts, I witnessed thousands of matches, hundreds of competitions, dozens of demonstrations. But I never saw anything quite like that Thursday evening in 1974. I never saw someone so thoroughly outclass an opponent while showing such complete respect. I never saw victory achieved through education rather than domination. Chuck Norris didn't come to Kansas City to defeat Frank Morrison, but he left having taught everyone present, including me, what mastery truly looks like. Not violence, not ego, not domination, just absolute, undeniable, humble skill. The story persists because the lesson persists. In dojos across America, in conversations between martial artists who remember the tournament circuit of the 1970s, in the teaching of students who learned from Frank Morrison after he evolved, in the recognition that sometimes the most profound victories come without throwing a single real strike. Chuck Norris went on to Hollywood, to action films, to television, to becoming a cultural icon, to Chuck Norris jokes and memes and pop culture references that turned him into a caricature of toughness. But the people who were there that Thursday evening in Kansas City, they knew something the memes didn't capture. They knew that beneath the movies and the myths was something real, something tested, something proven not through choreography, but through the kind of quiet, controlled demonstration that only true mastery can deliver. 47 seconds. That's all it took. 47 seconds for a champion to learn humility, for a crowd to witness mastery, for a legend to be born not through violence, but through the absence of it. They called him Hollywood. 47 seconds later, they called him Sensei.